영상의 구성은 다음과 같습니다. 그럼 한번 시작해 볼까요?
Speaking of like bacteria, what about sponges? 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 So in the video, we heard the phrase speaking of, and the way it came was speaking of like bacteria, what about sponges? And I put like in parentheses here because she said it, but grammatically correct, you really don't need it. It's just because she was speaking. And sometimes when you're talking, you add words or maybe leave out words that you wouldn't normally do in a more formal situation. So even though it's literally it was speaking of like bacteria, what about sponges? It really could just be speaking of bacteria, what about sponges?
I see.
Okay. So this is another thing I learned in the video is like sponges. Okay, hey, so would you please read the sentence for me?
Sure. Speaking of bacteria, what about sponges?
Yeah. And do you know what bacteria is?
Is it, I don't know, it's really hard to explain since it's a scientific word.
Yep, scientific
It's a
term.
little
Yes.
like a thingy, like a living creature that we don't see, but it's there and it's doing something.
Yeah, and I would a good synonym for bacteria maybe would be germs.
Germs, gotcha.
Okay, but you're right. They're teeny tiny, they're microscopic, which isn't the phrase we were going to talk about, but I think to know what bacteria is helps with knowing the overall understanding. So yeah, so if we're speaking of bacteria, oh, what about those sponges? So what do you
Ooh.
use in your kitchen? Do you use a sponge or a cloth?
I think we use both
Both?
sponges and cloth. Yeah.
Yeah, we pretty exclusively use sponges, and
Mm.
let's just say we should replace it more often than we are.
How often do they recommend like replacing it?
Didn't they say this one every week?
Every week.
Every week, yeah.
That is kind of,
But
yeah.
they gave some, some tidbits or some fun facts
Nice.
about ways you could clean and sterilize the sponge you do have so that you don't necessarily have to replace it all the time. Because I feel like replacing a sponge every week could be potentially wasteful.
Right.
So if you can clean it, sterilize it, they recommended putting it in the microwave, and
Nice.
and I will sometimes put my sponge in the dishwasher. I figure, well, if it's sterilizing the dishes, the dishwasher would probably sterilize the sponge too.
Makes sense. Yeah.
So yeah, anyway, that's enough about bacteria and sponges. So what we have going here is speaking of, and that's an expression we use that will introduce some topic that's kind of related to the subject that was previously mentioned or being talked about. So without even knowing what the video said, I would know that they said, speaking of bacteria, that whatever else they were talking about before was also about bacteria.
Gotcha. So you can make a guess, right?
Yep, you can kind of make that guess that, oh, okay, well, we're on the subject of or the topic of bacteria, right? And so speaking of, just introduce something related, but still a little bit different.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay. So here's a sentence to give you another example of speaking of. So that's my favorite movie. Speaking of, did you know there will be a sequel next year? Right. So I'm talking about my favorite movie, or myself and another person. We're talking about favorite movies. I say, oh, yeah, that one was my favorite. And oh, speaking of, there's going to be a sequel next year. So it's kind of a new topic, but it's still linked to the previous topic.
I see.
Make sense?
Yeah, it does. Quick question though.
Yes, go for it.
So in your sentence, so speaking of that part that doesn't include my favorite movie or movie, something like that, do you usually leave that part out? Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah, I do know what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think you could go either way,
Okay.
but I think perhaps the more natural would be to say, oh, speaking of, or maybe say, speaking of that.
Oh, okay.
Okay. But anybody who hears this expression would know that, oh, yeah, even though I don't say speaking of movies,
They
the
know.
listener would know that I'm talking about what was previously talked about, which was the movie.
I see.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
Thank you.
So how about your turn? Would you read the movie sentence for me, please?
Of course. That's my favorite movie. Speaking of, did you know there will be a sequel next year?
Yeah. Yep. Good. Do you know what a sequel is?
Actually, I don't know what that
Oh,
is.
it means like part 2 of the movie.
Oh, okay. It's kind of series.
Yes. Yes. There you go. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's like what's coming next.
Oh,
I can't think of any examples.
Batman, Indiana Jones.
Oh, Indiana Jones. There you go. Because how many sequels have there been to that one?
A lot. Probably 4 or 5 for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So have you seen the newest one?
Not yet. Yeah. Did it come out already?
Yeah, I think it did in the theater
Really?
anyway.
Wow.
Oh, and Harrison Ford says this will be the last one. So
Speaking of
speaking
Harrison
of,
Ford,
right.
I'm kind of
Will he make any
wondering.
more movies?
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering how many movies he has been in. Probably more than 100
Altogether?
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's a little homework assignment. How many movies has Harrison Ford been in?
Or we can easily Google it later. Okay, never mind.
Exactly. Oh, but then you can put them in categories
Yes.
like action adventure, drama,
Wow.
rom-com.
Exactly.
There. Yeah. So, okay. So synonyms for speaking of, about, regarding, concerning, relating to. So, about bacteria. What about sponges? Regarding bacteria, concerning bacteria, or relating to bacteria. Okay, all of those would mean the same thing. Although I really think if you use an expression like speaking of, to me, that just sounds more interesting than about bacteria. And I think it's a more sophisticated use of the language to use common expressions.
I see.
All right. So give me a speaking of sentence.
Speaking of, okay. So I just came up with a really good example.
All right.
It seems like my phone is getting old. So speaking of, I just heard new iPhone will come out in 2 days. So probably I will keep an eye on that event.
Okay. That was an excellent use of the expression. And is that true about the iPhone?
Yes, it's true.
Okay. So I don't think I'm ready for a new phone, but I appreciate.
Me neither.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate that fun fact.
Wow, look at you.
Look at us.
It seems like you're learning English, not me.
I'm just making sure to use the expressions we talk about.
You must have been a really good student.
I was a very good student, and I hope I'm a very good teacher.
You are. Thank you.